Thank you. Welcome and good morning.
Great pleasure to be back.
Great pleasure to be back. Well, indeed, it is a back. Because, of course, you and I sat here exactly 2 years ago. And could you have imagined 2 years ago that at least 2 wars that were waging then, it was the beginning of the war in Gaza, it was nearly 2 years into the war in Ukraine. Could you imagine that those wars would still be waging and that we'd have more?
I sincerely hoped that that would not be the case, but I was not very optimistic at the time, and I think I had good reasons not to be optimistic. We see that for the moment negotiations in relation to Ukraine are stuck with the clear difference of position of both sides. And on the other hand, Gaza, we have a ceasefire. Even now, ceasefires are something in which people go on shooting. But, I mean, at least it's much less than what it was. But there are lots of question marks about the future. Now, I think it's important in relation to the Ukraine, in the present moment, not to forget the principles. First, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. And second, when we look at a conflict, the solution of the conflict should abide by international law, which means the Charter, and which means the respect for the territorial integrity of states. Is it going to be so? Probably not. But this could not be. The violation of these rules is extremely dangerous, because everywhere in the world people will feel that they can do whatever they want, because international law doesn't matter anymore. And so I hope that the way the negotiations end will respect these principles, even if I understand that that will not be easy. And in relation to Gaza, I think it's important to make the ceasefire work. I think it's important that the resolution that the General Assembly, that the Security Council approved, with the proposal of the United States, is implemented. There is the creation of the peace group and then the local, I would say, government of technocrats. And then there is something that is absolutely essential, in my opinion, is to keep a link between Gaza and the West Bank, between Gaza and the Palestinian Authority, and to allow this to be a first step for a two-state solution to become a reality. So people say, if I may just note, people say, well, the two-state solution is impossible, it will not happen. The question is, what is the alternative? A one-state solution in which either 5 million people are expelled, or a one-state solution in which you have 5 million people without any real rights. This is totally unacceptable in the 21st century. So we need to make sure that we have a ceasefire that holds, that humanitarian distribution goes on improving, and it is improving at the present moment, and at the same time that we pave the way for a true peace in the Middle East.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll come back to both Gaza and Ukraine in a second. You make a good point that the ceasefire has become a lesser fire. It should be called lesser fire rather than ceasefire, which is a good point. But I'm going to come back to that. But I actually wanted to start with climate, because you've just been in Brazil for the COP30. This was your 9th COP, I believe. And the deal that was reached has been described as everything from a win to a joke. And many are increasingly skeptical over getting any consensus around climate goals, basically with the harsh geopolitical reality of a disengaged U.S., a politically weak EU, and powerful BRICS that aren't really persuaded by the argument of industrialized countries. So what's your view? Do you agree? Is consensus dead?
No. To be honest, I have mixed feelings about the COP. On one hand, I think it is remarkable that with the United States out and campaigning against, with the fossil fuel industry clearly determined to make sure that things would not move forward, because today it is clear that renewables are cheaper, and it is clear that they are the solution from the point of view of climate. With all these movements against, it was possible to have an agreement. And this shows that multilateralism works. So you have countries, developed countries, emerging economies, small islands, with contradictory interests, but it was possible to come to an agreement, which means the multilateral system is still working. Now, the other side of the mixed feelings. The agreement is, of course, disappointing in many aspects. And what worries me more is that we are, at the present moment, in a situation in which the scientific community is already unanimous in recognizing that we are going to go above 1.5 degrees. We will be overshooting in the early 2030s, which means that the consequences that climate change has in our lives, you see what has happened in Jamaica, the heat waves that kill so many people, the drought that is largely responsible in some areas for food insecurity. It's a driver of migration, and it's a driver of conflict, namely when farmers and herders dispute water that is no longer there. I mean, this overshoot means that all these things that we are witnessing will get more frequent, more dramatic, and worse impact on people. So it's absolutely essential to have this overshoot as short as possible and with the minimum possible intensity, and to go back to temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And that is possible. But that requires that we peak emissions now, they are still growing. That requires a drastic reduction of emissions in the next few years. That requires net zero in 2050 and net negative after 2050. And the problem is we are not going in that direction.
What role, in all of this that you've described, what role does China have? Because, you know, they seem to be a defender of the Paris Agreement, but especially in light of the U.S. being disengaged. But is this climate leadership really, or is China using its green technology to wield soft power that we're going to see in other areas?
I think that, to a certain extent, both things are true. The Chinese...
You are too much of a diplomat.
No. The Chinese have presented nationally determined contributions, like all other countries. Or some have not yet, but they will be presenting, which means climate action plans. We would need a reduction of emissions until 2035 of 60%. And the plans that exist lead to 10%, which means we need to dramatically accelerate the reduction of emissions. And that, of course, brings to the center of the stage the question of the phasing out from fossil fuels. Now, if we look at the Chinese, what they present, they presented a reduction of only 10%. In our calculations, to get this average that I mentioned, they should give about 25%. The interesting thing is that when one looks at their commitments in the past, they've always done better than what they asked, what they promised. And I've discussed it several times with Xi Jinping. Why don't you tell us what you will be able to do? And he always says...
What does he say?
He always says, we will never we will never be unable to fulfill our promises. So we need to be conservative in the promises to make sure that we are credible on this. The good news is that looking in the projects that exist, China will do better than this 10%. And so it is clear that an acceleration of reduction of emissions is essential in China from the point of view of the world, because they represent 30% of the emissions today. It is clear that they are moving very fast, and it is also clear that because they have invested massively in this new technology, and let's be honest, in Europe and the United States, this was forgotten. they today have a domination of the global market in this area. And of course, that is something that they use. But the response to that is to do a strong investment, not only in this technology, but in the next generation of technologies. Because they started many years ago. And hydrogen, green hydrogen is probably a very important bet that Western countries should be doing to gain in relation to the next market dispute about energy.
If for nothing else, to attempt to surpass China. But let's turn to the U.S. and President Donald Trump. So you're ending your 10 years as UN Secretary General as you began with Donald Trump as president. During your meeting with him in September, during the UNGA, the General Assembly, he said that he backs the UN 100%, but he also said that the UN is not living up to its potential. Can you describe your relationship with President Trump?
Well, it is a very simple thing. It's a relation based, on one hand, being totally faithful in relation to the principles I defend and the values that the UN represents. And of course, we go on fighting for climate action, fighting for gender equality, fighting for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, fighting for reforms in the Security Council, in international financial institutions. We don't move an inch on the principles that we stand for. But to do that, you don't need to enter into a permanent polemic or confrontation. So our system is be what we are, do not make any concession that puts into question the fidelity of the values we defend, but not to engage in polemics that serve no purpose.
So and that's what Donald Trump is doing? That's what you're saying Donald Trump is doing?
That's what I said I'm doing.
But that he is engaging in the polemics.
Well, there is only one way to have a polemic, is if the two parts enter into the polemic. I'm not interested in having any polemic with the U.S. administration. I'm interested in preserving the values of the UN and preserving the values in which I believe we can build a world that is more fair, in which international law is respected, and in which the huge inequalities that exist can be overcome.
I mean, in more detail, of course, I suppose, sort of, what do you think is the permanent damage that is being done to the UN, but also to the mission that you just described of the UN by the U.S., the foreign aid cuts, and the significant U.S. arrears for the regular UN budget, for the peacekeeping budget? What permanent damage is being done?
Well, there are three different things. One are the voluntary contributions, especially for development and humanitarian agencies. There was a dramatic cut with the end of USAID. The UN organizations were able to very effectively shrink, reduce their activity. A lot of staff had to leave. But the organizations are there, and they remain solid. But the problem is not with the UN organizations. The problem is with the people that we were supporting. And there the consequences are quite dramatic. A reduction of the levels of humanitarian aid that is provided, as we are witnessing now, makes many people die, makes many people suffer all kinds of negative impacts in health, in food security, in basic sanitation, and in all other aspects that correspond to the basic services that people need.
Is there one that strikes you, on this, because it's an important point, is there one thing that you have seen over the past year that has really struck you as being as suffering as a result of the cuts?
Or the reduction of vaccines, for instance. But it's not only the United States. I think it's important to say that many other developed countries are reducing in a significant way their humanitarian support. So we have, as you are aware, an enormous concern with defense, namely in Europe, a lot of increase of military expenditure, and that military expenditure to protect countries should be paid by the countries themselves. That's why tax systems exist, but they are partially being paid by reducing humanitarian aid, which of course makes the poor pay for the needs of the rich, which is unfair and morally difficult to justify. But there are other aspects. Peacekeeping is another dimension. In peacekeeping, the United States have provided half of the budget. And we are doing, because we had contingency plans for these different scenarios that were possible, we are doing at the present moment, all over the world, in all our peacekeeping missions, a reduction of 25% of the troops and police present there. Of course, it has a consequence. Protection of civilians will inevitably suffer. In relation to the regular budget, it's not yet clear what will be the position of the United States. Last year there was a loss of about 400 million. So we have been very careful. We have a total control of our expenditure, and we will come to the end of the year, even without the US contribution, but being able, with cuts that were made, to do our work. At the same time, we are doing a number of very important reforms within the system. Some people say that these reforms were a response to the US presence, to US positions. But the truth is that many of these reforms were prepared, and the reforms I wanted to implement, but there was a huge resistance. Resistance of the system, all bureaucracies resist change, and resistance of member states with their differences. So I took profit of the moment in which there was a dramatic cut in the humanitarian aid that created a sense of panic in both member states and in the agencies. And I thought this is the moment to move ahead with a huge package of reforms to make the UN Secretariat and the UN as a whole much more effective, more cost-effective, avoid duplications, make some mergers, make back offices common, supply chains common. I mean, a way to completely transform the way we do business, doing business together instead with the constellation that we presently have with different UN organizations.
So in a way, the U.S., this administration prompted you to do something that should have been done anyway.
That I wouldn't say prompted, created an opportunity. For resistances that existed to be removed.
Got it.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, exactly.
It's not yet finished.
Let's move to Ukraine. We've obviously seen a flurry of talks, of proposals, and counter-proposals. What is the compromise that can bring peace to Ukraine? In very clear and specific detail.
As far as I understand the negotiations that are taking place, the Russian position is the request of recognition not only of the territory that they occupy, but also of the rest of Donbass. And the Ukrainians still dominate a meaningful part of Donetsk, in which they have the strongest fortifications and lines of defense that Ukraine has in the whole of its territory. It's Kramatorsk, it's Slavyansk, and another city further south. And obviously, the Russians want an agreement in which the Ukrainians give that to Russia. And as you can imagine, this is something that, from a Ukrainian point of view, is completely unacceptable. On the other hand, I believe the Ukrainian position at the present moment is to say, okay, let's have a ceasefire, let's freeze the lines where they are, without recognition of the legality of the new situation, and let's negotiate from then on. Which means the principle of territorial integrity would not be put into question because there wouldn't be a recognition. And it's very interesting to see when there was the 26 points that there was a sentence de facto about the Russian occupation, which is rather ambiguous, whether it would be a recognition or not.
Exactly.
But the point is, the Russians want to occupy part of the Ukraine and want that to be recognized without sanctions, and want then Ukraine to lose.
But is that inevitably the basis of any compromise? Why would Russia agree to anything else?
Why? Because I think that Russia is paying also a huge price with what's happening. If you look at the Russian economy has completely changed. The number of people that died is huge, and I doubt the Russian capacity to take that fortress that I mentioned.
But we were saying this 4 years ago when everybody thought it was going to be short-lived. We were saying this 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that the Russian economy was suffering and the Russian position would change. And do you think that the U.S. is now listening or bending even to the Russian demands too easily?
No, I think that when I see what's happening, there is one agreement made with Russia, then there is one agreement made with Ukraine. The two are not compatible, then they go again to Russia, and then sincerely, I believe we are still far from a solution.
Okay. Gaza, we talked about this a little bit. When we met in 2023, this was 1 month into the war, you told us that the number of civilians that were killed at the time showed that there was something clearly wrong with Israel's military operations. What is your assessment of the way that the war has been conducted?
I think I would repeat today what I said 2 years ago. I think there was something fundamentally wrong in the way this operation was conducted, with total neglect in relation to the deaths of civilians and to the destruction of Gaza. There is a kind of a paradox. After this whole period, Gaza, the objective was to destroy Hamas. Gaza is destroyed, but Hamas is not yet destroyed. So there is something fundamentally wrong in the way this is conducted.
Have war crimes been committed?
There are strong reasons to believe that that possibility might be a reality.
What is the right avenue for accountability?
I think the right avenue for accountability is, of course, the use of the international justice system. I mean, you have the ICJ, you have the ICC.
Not recognized.
Not recognized, it's true. But I do believe that it is important that the world has courts that represent the international community as a whole. The ICJ represents the international community as a whole, there is no doubt about it. The ICC has the difficulties that we all know, but I have confidence in what the ICJ is doing. I think they have been very clear in relation to what has happened in Gaza and in relation to what Israel is supposed to do. Now things have changed. And I have to say, by the way, in relation to our relationship with the United States, I have to say that the United States have been very instrumental in order for obstacles to be removed in relation to humanitarian aid in Gaza. It has considerably improved because of the pressure of the US over Israel, because they have leverage that, of course, we do not. I think it's important also to recognize that there is a serious effort to find a political solution.
Now we're entering, the phase 2. Do you think that the U.S. president will hold both Israel and Hamas's feet to the fire to get to actual peace as opposed to this?
I sincerely hope so. And there is one thing I can guarantee: in everything that has to do with peace, we are ready to fully cooperate with the United States administration.
The relationship between Israel and the UN has become somewhat contentious. Has the U.S. signaled to you what the U.S. thinks a future UN role could look like in Gaza, and as you say, in Gaza, but more widely there?
According to the resolution of the UN Security Council, the role of the UN is the humanitarian role. And that recognition is very important. Let's not forget that just a few months ago, there was this idea that the UN would not be the right way to do it. It should be a foundation or whatever, and we had all the stories that I'm not going to repeat. The truth is that the role of the UN has now been formally recognized, and more than that, there is an excellent cooperation in the humanitarian aid between the UN and the US. I hope that this will be maintained and developed. The UN has no role to play at the present moment in the political discussions, but we are ready in all areas that the international community will decide. We are ready to fully cooperate. For us, this is an absolute priority. We are not seeking protagonism, but we are totally available to do whatever is required.
Let me switch to Venezuela, which has been in the news. Venezuela has complained to you about the U.S. military action in the Caribbean. A group of independent UN experts has described the U.S. strikes as extrajudicial executions. Do you agree?
The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has been clear that international law is not compatible with this kind of strikes. And so my strong appeal is to avoid in the Caribbean a situation of confrontation that could have much more dramatic consequences than the strikes that are happening at the present moment. I have no particular sympathy for the regime in Venezuela and the violations of human rights that were committed, that are well known, but I don't think a military confrontation would be the solution for the problem. I think.
So you're in agreement with this independent?
This should be done through pressure and dialogue.
Got it. Let me ask you about Syria. UN Security Council is visiting Syria this week. Your former envoy for Syria hinted at concerns over Syria's trajectory before he stepped down in October. What are the opportunities that Syria's new new leaders have missed in sort of building a transition that was based more on transparency, accountability, and what can the UN do about it?
Well, we are actively cooperating with the government in order to try to make the government do what we believe is the right thing, because we need to have a Syria in which all communities feel that they are represented, that they belong. And this must be true for the different groups that until now do not trust the new regime. And obviously the new regime is a complex thing, because it was the group that was in Idlib, with people coming from all parts of the world, that in the past had a trajectory that was not exactly of a group of angels. And I think that we have here the need to combine two things. First, to recognize that a number of things are not happening as they should, namely the capacity to give the Christians, to give the Kurds, to give the Druze confidence in the new regime, Unfortunately, we had the Alawites situation, we had the Druze situations, the Kurdish. So the regime must do much more in order for these communities to feel that they belong, and we need to insist on that. But on the other hand, the solution is not to, be hostile to the new Syria. The solution is to engage, to support them in, namely, the economic development aspects. And I'm glad that the US led the removal of sanctions to support them on these. But at the same time, to use our influence, ours, UN, less important than the influence that some countries can have, both in the region and further afield, use our influence to make the new authorities understand that the fragmentation of Syria is still a possibility, and it is absolutely essential to avoid it by accepting to recognize all communities as part of the nation.
We have to wrap up, but I just have, you mentioned UNHCR, and so I cannot not ask you about comments that were made by President Trump yesterday, I believe. This was in regard to Somali immigrants in this country. And you said, Trump says, we will go the wrong way if we keep taking garbage into our country. What do you say to that?
Well, those words stay with who pronounced them. What I think is important is to recognize that countries have the right to manage their borders, but countries have the obligation to respect international law in relation to refugees and to respect the rights of migrant people.
Very clear. And then you asked me before what Reuters is doing with AI, and we talked a little bit about it. And so my question to you is, how should artificial intelligence be regulated globally?
It's difficult to give you an answer. I can tell you what we have done in the UN.
Very pithily, because we have to close.
We managed to get consensus, to create, and we are doing it as we speak, an international independent scientific panel on AI, able to report periodically about what's happening, because we don't know what's happening, and to inform all governments of what's happening and what are the problems that exist. Second, we created a mechanism of dialogue of all stakeholders. Now, the problem of regulation is a problem where we have no competence, and we understand that there are different views about regulation of AI. For me, the most important principle is to preserve human agency. We cannot make artificial intelligence act in a way that human agency disappears, that the humans have not the final control, especially about the most potential dramatic impacts of artificial intelligence. For instance, in wars.
In wars, exactly. Well, we'll have to invite you back, every year to see where we're proceeding on that. Last question. This is your 10th final year as Secretary General. What is your biggest regret?
My biggest regret? It's difficult to say because there are so many things I would like to be able to do and that I couldn't. But my biggest regret is to see that there is not a global consensus about the reforms that the international system requires in order to adapt to the new realities of the world. I am a strong supporter of multilateralism. And I believe that there is no way we can solve things better than through multilateral mechanisms. But the institutions we have now, the Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the others that are the basis of multilateralism need reform. And I would like to have seen a much stronger will of countries, and especially of the most powerful countries, to understand that it is in their interest to adapt the multilateral institutions to the realities of today's world that are very different from 1945.
Very different from 1945. On that historical note, then, thank you very much, Secretary General. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Really insightful conversation. Thank you.